Hello, in this video I want to kind of continue off where we did in the last video, talking a little bit more about Moten and the worker strike. I definitely think, like I said before, that this is a really interesting place to kind of like think about all the possible avenues, because I definitely see it being in the future of this resolution in one way or another, and I definitely believe that it'll be something that K-teams can gravitate towards because of the way it makes central criticisms about like the kind of like value of the resolution as a whole, and makes a lot of good arguments about the relationship between like state recognition and the parasitic engagement that has with various types of movements and the way that we kind of like organize ourselves. And so I definitely think that it's really extremely important to consider the ways in which this touches like all types of arguments, and also the way in which you should kind of be responding to this argument. And so in the last video we started off talking about like what types of policy responses are really viable and good versus this type of argument, and that's definitely where I want to continue. If you're kind of just jumping in here, I would definitely say watch the video immediately before this, because it gives a lot of the kind of like top level framing and thesis concerns and priorities for what is really going to frame the conversation that's happening in this video. And this video is kind of a continuing of that conversation, because I kind of like doing them in like two-part chunks that give me a little bit more time to like talk about like explicit portions of the debate. And I definitely think that if you're really just interested in Moten as a whole, and you're really trying to get a better idea of what arguments really are kind of like happening with that at all, and like what are the best kind of arguments that come from the literature base that are going to end up on the resolution, then I would definitely suggest watching the intro to a worker strike and Moten video, because I definitely think it's helpful for the stuff we'll be talking about here as well. But to kind of like start off where we left off in the last video, I think that when we're just generally talking about things like the link debate, it really comes to a question of being able to win that top level conversation that we were having in the last video about the kind of like value of being able to compare the app to the status quo. I think that argument compiled with a question of with a pressuring of the alternative is a place where you really want to stick a lot of your link responses here. I definitely think that you can diversify these types of arguments, because I feel like they're the way in which you kind of like make these arguments feel really nuanced, and not just being like, oh, the plan's still better than the status quo, or oh, this is just a link to the status quo, is adding texture to those arguments by being like the kind of like refusal that they want us to have of the political looks like X group who had like this end result because of the way in which their movement collapsed in relationship to the state, etc. And then being able to win why that kind of like identifies with the way in which the 1AC is able to progress and change the ways in which groups are able to assert themselves politically, or unions, worker strikes, etc. are able to exert themselves politically. And then I think kind of like coupling that with an argument of just being like, without the recognition of the state, if we are to agree that those movements are like under attack from the state, are at war with the state in the way that you kind of describe from the way in which the negative stance will happen, then there isn't really a way for us to think about the possibility of a commensuration between the two, or a non-militant response from the state in a world where we don't think about the possibilities of state recognition as an avenue for how we're able to create like zones where people can like do these acts and not feel like they're choosing between being able to assert themselves as like agents of resistance, like their families, etc., etc. And I think that doing so is just incredibly important in how you're able to spin a lot of these link arguments against them, because I feel like oftentimes policy teams don't pay enough attention to the link argument, and they're kind of just going there and just be like, this isn't our plan, or being like, this is just a link to the status quo. And I think on this resolution in particular, you have so many like historical arguments to pull from to be like, even if this isn't just a link to the status quo, we can talk to the way in which this has happened throughout history, and the endpoint of that could still mean like a differential view of like how we should relate to politics, but it does not mean the complete refusal of the terms in which we like interact and engage the law. And I think making arguments that kind of like situate oneself there is like a really good place to kind of like start off your response to the link debate. And then I think that also creates a lot of the necessary conditions for you to be able to like execute a permutation if you really want to pivot into that, because I definitely think that like the kind of like examples that you're setting up in the link debate above translate into being able to like win direct net benefits on the permutation. And I think the more you kind of like get in depth to the link arguments, the more kind of like nuanced responses they need to have in order for them to like defend themselves from being able to answer the permutation, which I think is just like incredibly important in terms of your ability to kind of like decide how you want to deal with a lot of the offense. And I think it's also incredibly important to like just keep your terminal defense in the debate by being able to repackage this work that you're doing above as kind of additional work that proves the value of doing something like the permutation. I think that the permutation gets a lot more help in these scenarios when you're able to apply why the kind of like evaluation of the affirmative versus the status quo, coupled with the examples of how like things like the alternative could progress backwards, or like the way in which the affirmative makes things like the alternative possible, all allow you to kind kind of like establish not only an argument for why it's legit in terms of its procedural terms, but also why at a material level it allows like much more gain than the alternative alone. And then it kind of allows you to like pivot in a place where now you just need to continue to apply pressure to the alternative, and every piece of offense that you win against it leads the judge more into thinking about the permutation as a viable strategy and using it to write their ballot. I think that when you kind of like apply this type of logic to what you should be doing on the impact comparison debate, I don't think that you need to necessarily win an extinction claims debate every round. I really think that you need to win more proximate arguments about the refusal to like allow to recognition from the state creates like more material disasters for those that are like trying to find resistance outside of the state. That not only is it a question of crackdown itself, but it's also a question of the way in which the state kind of like invests and works in the ability to like hoard resources, to produce scarcity, etc. And all those things require a dramatic change in the type of political arena that we take up in order to like create like basically redistribution in terms of those resources. And so I think that a lot of the arguments that you want to make are about why the kind of like immediate consequences of the AF allow for like fixes to not only the proximate kind of like causes of like the violence that is like being protested as being resisted against, but also allows room for a much more structural response. But it doesn't like allow the state to continue to hoard and create disaster in the way that it does currently, which I think is really important for you to be able to continue to weigh that as a kind of like material discrepancy that the other team has to deal with. I then feel like at an alternative level, like it's not just a question of how you can win crackdown arguments, but also how you can win arguments about like the question of the viability of the inevitability of the state, even if they don't have to run to the state at a level of crackdown. The idea that people don't have to face the displacement of the law regardless of whether or not they decide to resist out of it is like false. And the idea that we should just have this kind of continued inevitable refusal of the state doesn't allow it to be destituted because of the way in which it's already like asserted and set up by so many private enterprises and those that are like fully invested in its maintenance. And I feel like a lot of your arguments just need to be like, if there is no way the alternative can avoid that kind of inevitability, what is a better option than the plan? And I feel like most of the alternatives kind of like either are just going to continue to try to push down examples of like stuff that's done materially or able to win that's just like state recognition isn't good by itself. But I definitely think that's where a lot of your more like generic responses of why kind of like liberalism is self-correcting, why it responds to citizenship and agency and stuff like that are a lot easier in order to make prominent in these debates and more offensive. Hopefully this is helpful and hopefully use it in your own debates, and yeah, keep watching videos. Thanks.